Welcome to my presentation on language for making comparisons and an introduction to clauses. The purpose of this video is twofold. First, I'm going to go over the grammar of making comparisons. My hope here is that if you understand the grammar, you might begin to feel more confident using this language in your writing. Second, the prompts that open in this video give you an opportunity to practice making comparisons. You can choose to write sentences comparing elephants, chimpanzees, and geladas as in exercise D on page 20 in Pathways, or you can write sentences that you can use in your 2-paragraph comparison paper. I've organized this presentation in a way that makes sense to me and will hopefully make sense to you as well. We're going to begin with expressing similarities, and then the last similarity we'll look at is using like, and because using like and unlike are so similar, I'm going to do those two together. Then we'll move on to expressing differences with adverb phrases. We're going to take a slight break and look at clauses before we look at expressing differences with adverb clauses. So let's begin by looking at using the word both to express a similarity. So first we have here both being used in front of a noun phrase. So our noun phrase is humans and other primates. It's made up of a noun, a conjunction, an adjective, and a noun. That's our noun phrase. And we've put the word both in front of it as emphasis. And all of this makes up the subject of our subject verb object sentence. You can also use both with a noun phrase where the nouns are singular. So I could say both a person and a primate. And it's plural because the two things together make up two things. Each thing makes up two things. Once you have identified what two things you're comparing, you can use both as a pronoun by itself. And so here you see the subject both followed directly by the verb use. And then the rest of your sentence is the object. So both use conflict and cooperation in groups, where both is simply a pronoun. Okay, now let's take a look at the two adverbs that we can use to express similarities. So you might remember from the video on parts of speech that adverbs can modify entire sentences. And that's what you can do with likewise and similarly. And just like other adverbs that modify sentences, these are followed by a comma. So here we have likewise, comma, and then your sentence. And similarly, your comma and the rest of your sentence. You can also think of these types of adverbs as connecting the sentence that came before it to the one it starts. So for example, the two things we're comparing, this one is human boys and girls. And this word likewise connects this sentence to the one that follows it about young chimps. So those are the two things that we are comparing. And notice the similarity between the objects of these sentences. Choose different toys and have shown gender-driven toy preferences. So this likewise connects those two ideas. And the same happens here. Here we're talking about humans. We're comparing them to chimpanzees, and we're saying that these two ideas, living in harmony and avoiding conflict, are similar. As a side note, neither of these adverbs are commonly used when speaking. Similarly is not an easy word to say, even for native English speakers. And likewise is most commonly used as a single word response to someone else's statement, such as I'm hungry or I had a bad day. Saying likewise in response is the same as saying me too. Okay, and now let's take a look at the phrase to be similar to. Your book suggests learning this as a phrase, but I don't think they stressed it enough. The idea here is that similar is not just a standalone word. In order to use it correctly in a sentence, it must have a form of to be in front of it and to after it. Essentially, it is the verb complement part of an SVC sentence as shown here. So here's your noun phrase or subject, office workers, your be verb here, followed by the adjective similar. That's your complement. And notice that after similar, we have to add to plus the things that are being compared, in this case, apes. So apes are being compared to office workers. The last way to express similarities in this unit is with like. I've paired it with unlike here because they're kind of unique in the way that they're used. Basically, these words are paired with a noun, like humans. So here's your adjective like, and here's your noun humans, or a noun phrase. In this case, young female chimps is your noun phrase, and before it you have the adjective unlike. Both of these are then followed by a comma and a sentence that begins with the subject that is being compared in the phrase. So here we have, we begin with chimpanzees. These are being compared to humans. And following the comma, we have young males. And it's assumed that those are chimps because you're comparing them to the young female chimps here. Now let's move on to expressing differences with adverb phrases. Thinking about these two adverb phrases in contrast and on the other hand, in the same way as the adverbs similarly and likewise is probably the easiest and simplest approach. So first, the only reason that they're not adverbs is that they're made up of more than one word. That makes them phrases. But they essentially work the same way as the adverbs likewise and similarly. So notice here, we begin the sentence in contrast, follow it with a comma, and there's the rest of your sentence. And notice that it also is showing a comparison between the idea in the first sentence. We're comparing male gorillas and in this case, female geladas. And we're saying here that males have the power in a gorilla family group. And that's in contrast or different from the idea that females basically have the power or make decisions in a gelada family group. So hopefully you can see the ways that this phrase is being similarly used as similarly or likewise would be. And same with on the other hand. Here it begins the sentence followed by a comma, and we're comparing elephant families that are matriarchal. This, on the other hand, connects it to this idea that males have the power in gorilla groups and is showing that these two ideas are different from each other. Your book also mentions that these phrases can go after the subject. So I've included those examples here. We can have females, comma, in contrast, comma, make the decisions. So it's important to notice that if you're going to do that, you need a comma before and after your adverb phrase. So here we have males, comma, on the other hand, comma. However, as I mentioned before, I think it's easier and simpler to treat these as you would similarly and likewise, or single word adverbs. Okay, so we're going to pause here and look at clauses, because knowing about clauses will help you understand how to use the last two ways of expressing differences by using while and whereas. So a clause is simply a subject plus a verb. Some clauses, like an independent clause, are a sentence. Clauses that are not a sentence are called dependent clauses. Sometimes they're also known as an independent clause, can also be known as a main clause, and a dependent clause as a subordinate clause. Learning how to write and use the different types of clauses in English is key to writing interesting and complex sentences. A single clause can be as short as a two-word sentence, like I tried. I is my subject, tried is my verb. It can also be a much longer sentence. So here, this is my entire subject. It's obviously a noun phrase, excuse me, and then I have the word continued, followed by a complement. What I want you to notice here is that it's not the length of a sentence that determines how many clauses are in it. As you'll see in a minute, it's the number of separate subjects and verbs. So this sentence has just one subject and one verb, as does this one. So here I have a sentence from the book that contains a dependent clause and an independent clause. So when sentences contain more than one clause, one of those clauses is often independent and the other dependent. There are a couple of ways to determine whether a clause is independent or dependent. One way is to say the clause out loud to yourself and see if it makes sense as a standalone sentence. So for example, if I said, it plays a limited role in the wild, I may not know what it refers to, but other than that, the sentence makes sense. However, if I said, while aggression is part of normal primate behavior, I'm left waiting for more information to follow. So that's one way to identify whether a clause is dependent or independent. Another way is to look at the first word in each clause. In this clause, it plays a limited role in the wild. It is the first word in the clause and the subject of the verb plays. So it's an independent clause because it begins with the subject and has the verb right after it. But in this clause, excuse me, the first word is the adverb while, and the subject, aggression, comes after it, followed by its verb. This word order identifies this clause as the dependent clause. So now we're going to end our look at language for expressing differences by looking at using adverb clauses that begin with while or whereas. So in this slide, I want you to notice that you can begin a sentence with a dependent clause, while aggression is part of normal behavior. And when you do this, you need to put a comma between the, you need to put a comma between the dependent clause and the independent clause. I can also begin my sentence with an independent clause followed by the dependent clause. However, when you do this, you do not separate the two clauses with a comma. Notice that in number 3 of exercise C on page 20 in your book, there is no comma separating the independent clause, male geladas are big and have bushy manes, from the dependent adverb clause, while female geladas are small and less distinctive looking. Unfortunately, there's an error in the language for writing box on page 19 in the sentence using whereas. In that sentence, which I've rewritten here, the independent clause is first. You can identify it by the fact that it can stand alone. Young male elephants live with their female family members. And it begins with the subject, young male elephants, followed by its verb, live. The second clause, whereas older males form their own groups, is dependent. We know this because it sounds incomplete, because it's missing important information. And it begins with the adverb whereas, followed by the clause's subject and verb, older males, and form. Therefore, there should be no comma separating these two clauses. Please make a note of this error in your book so you don't make the same mistake in your writing. And as always, let me know if you have any questions. This concludes the presentation on using language for comparisons and clauses.